Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another album of the week. This is episode number 164, and today's episode is a spotlight on I Was Watching My Death, the second full-length album from Polish death thrashers Magnus, originally released through Blackened Records on June of 1992, and since we are at least still pretty much around the last of June anyways, this album has already probably reached its 30th anniversary, so 30 again, to pretty much happy birthday to, of course, I Was Watching My Death by Magnus. So if you're not familiar with Magnus, these guys are are based out of Wrocław, Lower Silesia, Poland. Silesia, I hope I pronounced all this correctly. Poland, and were formed all the way back in 1987 and released their debut full-length album in 1989 that was titled Scarlet Slaughter, which I've got that page up right now, and it was originally released on December 10th of 1989 originally, I guess, on cassette through a very obscure label called Mill Records. But by the time of that album, two members of the band, I guess, had left after that being Bastard and Eddie. They both left Magnus after this album, and then, of course, would then be replaced by Greg and Guz. So, pretty much, this would round out the lineup that would be going into I Was Watching My Death in, I think, beginning in May of 1991. And we kind of do a much more better search up of of the years that they had left. Yeah, 1991. So they both pretty much had. This is where I guess them coming in leads into the recording sessions that would begin in May of 1991 at the Wrocław in Poland, I guess, or whatever studio in Wrocław, Poland. That would be again. It would be titled "The Gods of the Crime," and it only had 6 songs, which would end up being re-recorded in at the. Since I have it right here, the second demo tape that was released in 1992, again at the Isabellan Studios in Warsaw, Poland, in March of 1992, and this basically would be a re-recording of the, re-recorded songs, basically, even though there's at least one song. 2-song difference here that weren't on the original The Gods of the Crime demo from 1991. But it would be 8 songs here, and again, it would be around 30 minutes and 38 seconds for this demo here. And again, it would all feature songs that would eventually be on the actual follow-up album to Scarlet Slaughter, I Was Watching My Death. So I would say this would be the same studio, and this is where I think these were just slightly raw mixes, probably, for I Was Watching My Death. And so eventually, these songs, I guess whatever that they put on this demo, probably I guess use as a way to maybe search out for another label, even though the demo here, that was The Gods of the Crime, actually was released through a label called Carnage Records. For all I know, this was might have been, let me kind of look up, go on the page here real quick. Yeah, apparently changed name. Probably, does it say when it changed its name? Okay, changed their name to Carrion Records. So they probably left the label and then went with Blackened for I Was Watching My Death. So for all I know, they took these mixes and might have remixed everything and probably maybe record some other songs maybe for it. Probably 2 more or 3 more. I believe. Think 3 more. I know I'm kind of jumbling around a bit in information, but this is basically just were all stuff that was planted the seeds for basically what would be the second full-length album from Magnus. That's, of course, again, I Was Watching My Death. So in June of 1992, it's not specified what day in or week in June of 1992 that I Was Watching My Death was released on, but it was, according to Metal Archives, was released in June of 1992 through Blackened Records. So that's where we pretty much end up with this album right here. So without further ado, let me get into my overall thoughts and track listing, whatever, surrounding I Was Watching My Death. So here we go. Again, from this album, we have at least about 11 songs for I Was Watching My Death, and it all clocks in at the length of 40 minutes and 6 seconds. So these 11 songs are beginning with Psychosis, Oppressor, The Dictator, Gods of Crime, Hacking Cruise, Terminator, Sneering Whisper, the title track, That Is the Reason I'd Like You to Die, Away to the Cross, and then finally ending with Ragnarok, which is actually the only instrumental on the album, and it ends it, and it's probably the shortest song on the entire album. Again, clocks in, 2 minutes and 46 seconds. So there's pretty much your 11 songs, and again, most of these were at least for at some point in shape or form were on the previous two demos, The Gods of the Crime. Both the original recordings from 1991 and the re-recording from 1992. Again, the same year as the full-length album, so obviously this wasn't probably too long apart because of the... according to here, this was recorded in March 1992, so for all I know, this was released in maybe March or maybe April. And of course, then the next in June is with, so it's really not that far apart. Just a little bit, again, from the original demo release, at least the second demo release of The Gods of the Crime. So, if you're at least have been familiar or you're not familiar with just the overall style and the sound of Magnus, the best way I can describe I Was Watching My Death is basically if you combined the styles of at least the first two albums of the Dutch metal band Pestilence, and of course Schizophrenia, and Beneath the Remains, era Sepultura, and maybe throw on some Chacal, another Brazilian band. So it kind of has a little bit of that sort of almost real chaotic, kind of real raw, almost very uncooked kind of production style, and just the guttural sort of style and just frenziness of the Brazilian scene, but it has almost that almost kind of technical kind of feel of, let's say, bands like Pestilence. And again, I mostly compare it to, again, the first two albums from Pestilence, and again, including the great Consuming Impulse album. So it just has that kind of feel going, just the overall sort of, I guess, comparisons I really can give it, that kind of style. But it's still, yes, at times the sound does fall under almost a death metal terrain, it falls under that umbrella, but musically at times it's almost just more straight up raw, more brutal, more chaotic style of thrash metal. It just definitely comes across a lot more thrash metal. I mean, the vocalist here, Rob Bandit, his style is very much, at times, reminds me a little bit of Chords, of Chacal. So he has more of it's still kind of, it just has a very more of a very guttural, almost hollow, like he's almost breathing at times very heavily while he's singing, but still very harsh sounding. But yet it just somehow, it's not like straight up, Cookie Monster death metal vocals. But he still comes across where it's still very thrashy. I mean, yes, there is obviously those Slayer influences on here. I mean, they wasn't on my copy here of I Was Watching My Death, which is actually the 2012 bootleg release from Meth Head Records, which includes a demo cover of Slayer's South of Heaven. Again, it pretty much gives you a good idea of where they mostly get their influences of, but musically, I tend to draw a lot of comparisons to like some of the more Brazilian bands and, of course, a Dutch band like Pestilence. I tend to really draw those in, let's say, your typical like German bands, you know. So I don't really hear a whole lot of like Crater and everything, you know, or Sodom. I tend to hear, or even Destruction, you know, I just tend to really hear more bands like Sepultura and Chaco, and at least the sound of Magnus here than some of the more obvious names. But I think that's why I think this album is so interesting at times too, because I mean it comes from the land of Poland, but it doesn't sound like almost your typical what you would think a Polish, you know, thrash metal band would sound. I mean, I've heard plenty of Polish thrash metal bands, but Magnus come across like almost a band you would think you wouldn't think that they had at least it came from Poland. If I had probably had played this to somebody who was not familiar with the Polish scene, and they were familiar with the Brazilian scene, they would think that Magnus here would just sound like some unknown Brazilian metal band. He'd be like, "What the fuck are these sounds Brazilian? This is a band I've never heard of." You know, that would be like that kind of scenario there, just that similar situation. But they are from Poland, and it's just crazy because of it's not that very European sounding. It just sounds more South American, and it's just crazy. But it's such a great. But the thing is, it's a pretty cool record by its own right. Again, there's plenty of sick sort of riffs on here. A lot of great. Just again, it's my kind of speed when it comes to this style of, you know, very thrash metal that kind of borders on death metal. This is my kind of speed when it comes. I mean, especially just listening to like the opening song, you know, like a Psychosis to Oppressor, The Dictator, Gods of Crime, or Terminator, which I don't think lyrically is inspired by the Terminator film, the first one, because of I don't know. I think that they were writing these songs when I think Judgment Day was kind of slightly coming out, but I don't think it had yet been, as far as I know. But again, they probably, I don't know if they were inspired by, let's say, by the first movie. But again, it's just that I draw that because of, well, it's titled Terminator. Either way, it's another sort of great sort of song on its own right. It's fucking badass from beginning to end. The great sort of hypnotic kind of thrashy groove to its own right. And of course, like Sneering Whisper, the title track, Away to the Cross. These are all freaking fantastic songs, and I think are great examples of for if I were to, let's say, use as, let's say, just turn someone on to this one, you know, as like a recommendation. Be like, hey, check if you want to really get a good feel of what to expect from Magnus, here are these songs. You know, that's just the way I would do, you know, would approach, you know, just the way I would do things. But it's just, again, from start to finish, I think it's a freaking great record. It's just, again, I love the rawness of it. It's just perfect. I know that I do have, again, a bootleg release, and since 2017, there has been at least real official deluxe reissues of this album, again, through Death Throne Records. Again, 2 CDs and everything, so probably with much more better remastering and anything. But me, at the time when I had gotten this, because I'm going to tell you a little bit of my sort of story with how I, let's say, found out about this album, or how I was turned on to Magnus, was that back in the late 2000s, when I started really heavily going onto YouTube and searching up, you know, going down rabbit holes of finding a lot more obscure kind of bands, there was a trend on YouTube where people were doing compilation metal videos where they were throwing songs from different artists, and it was usually at times very genre topic, or genre specific. And so there was a lot of ones that's run around very obscure, at times like some of the best, let's say, or what they thought, you know, best obscure kind of thrash metal or death metal kind of songs, and they would just compile these with artwork and everything it would only be sampled some of these songs, but it would just go from one band to the next. And that's how I found about Magnus. And it was usually a song, and it was off of I Was Watching My Death. This was probably the most album that I would say that seemed to have been the more popular album, I guess. The more well-known album from these guys. Probably because of its artwork, which just looked more like you expect from your typical Florida kind of death metal band. Like you would think this might be that, since this was the early 90s and everyone was in the underground metal scene that was actively following it, obviously were aware of a lot of the stuff that's coming out of Florida. So let's say if this album had made its way as an import into the United States, let's say even over in Florida, it probably would have been this album and not really Scarlet Slaughter, because Scarlet Slaughter wouldn't make its way onto CD until the year that I Was Watching My Death came out, because it was only just released as a cassette on December 10th of 1989. But this was the album that probably would have caught more of the people's eye, just because of the artwork and everything, and the fact that it was on CD, and since this was during the big heyday of CDs and for music to begin with. So this was I think it was this album that made more people, I guess, somewhat aware of them. And at this point, it was probably the only album that people at least knew of, besides maybe if they had actively followed them at least into 94 with its follow-up album, Alcoholic Suicide. But that album was only released on cassette, just like what happened with the first album, and wouldn't see a CD release until 2008. So they were, I guess, that's where, I mean, I could go on and on about how pretty underrated and freaking cool I Was Watching My Death is, and I definitely should recommend it to anyone who loves the more extreme styles of thrash metal and just likes it. I mean, especially those who still want to buy things on record. There's still some, record reissues of this one out there. There is, even though it's not that easy to get a hold of, and it sucks, because I think it's definitely worthy of really checking out, especially those, let's say, of the metal theologians of the world. But after at least with I Was Watching My Death, and then when it came to releasing of Alcoholic Suicide, it seems like they were being plagued by a lot of, I guess, promotion. They were barely getting a whole lot of promotion, and it seems like they were just had very difficulty with getting a lot of good distribution. So it seems like after 1994, things were just beginning to really kind of slow down, and by 96 they pretty much had split up until 2007 when they got back together, and that's when they began to release stuff again. Was it 2010 they released their comeback album Acceptance of Death, and then in 2021 last year they released an album called Death Revolution. I mean, yes, 10 years apart from there, but still they're still active to this day. Even if they're not actively releasing albums, they're still there. They're still around. But it's probably albums like this that is why they probably got a bit of their reputation. And I think they are well deserving of that reputation. It's a freaking underrated album, and it's definitely a pretty good album to really kind of bestow upon someone who's really kind of into this kind of style of thrash metal. Just it's more extreme, it almost borders on the death metal. It's that right kind of blend, and I think it's great. So there we go. So that's it. Again, if you definitely are curious after let's say listening to me talk about this, and you're very curious on wanting to obtain this album, again, you could go on to Discogs, maybe go on to eBay, go on some distribution sites like maybe Awakening Records, maybe, or I don't know. That's actually from what, maybe just somewhere that you could probably can obtain it. It shouldn't be that difficult, but it probably is going to be a little bit difficult just because they don't have great distribution for some reason. But again, that probably is what gives this band its charm, is because of it feels a little more cooler, just to know that these guys are going to be a little bit more harder, so it might make things more sweeter, I guess, for the person that actually finds the sound for finally and gets a hold of it, and it'll be like, oh my god, I actually got the something from these guys. One of the more harder to kind of find kind of bands, you know. But that's pretty much the way it's probably going to be anyways. And so and if you end up paying anything for it, or if you're right now, probably should know about what the price might be for if you were to find, let's say, any of the reissues. It shouldn't cost you more than at least maybe 20 bucks, maybe 15 or 17, you know, depending, or maybe 10 bucks depending on what copies you find, let's say on eBay. Let's say, for example, the 2012 Meth Head Records copy that I own, which contains the just the mix mash of both recordings of the Gods of the Crime demos. So there, that's it. So hope all of you enjoyed. This is Heavy Thrasher saying I'm out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.